Good evening. I'm Catherine Raff, the Elizabeth McIlvaine Associate Curator of Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to this evening's virtual Soleiman lecture, From Palace to Cosmos, Assyrian Reliefs and the Construction of Empire, generously supported by the Mary Soleiman Lecture Fund. We're so glad to have you all joining us virtually, and we hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphones for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under View Options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We look forward to answering some of those at the end of the presentation. Closed captions are available and can be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. If you encounter any technical difficulties during today's program, again, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to assist you. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Seymour, Associate Curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Seymour's research focuses on the reception and representation of the ancient Near East and on Mesopotamian art of the first millennium BCE and early century CE. You can read more about his background by following the link that we're dropping in the chat right now. We are thrilled to hear from him this evening on the topic of Assyrian reliefs and the construction of empire. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that kind introduction. And thanks also to the engagement programs team at the Art Institute of Chicago for organizing and running this evening's lecture. I'd like to add my thanks to Mary Soleiman for supporting the Art Institute and this lecture. And finally, thank you to all of you for deciding to come and listen. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. My topic tonight is the art of Assyrian palaces. So let's get started by situating ourselves in space and time. The region we're talking about primarily is in northern Iraq, and all the palaces I'll talk about are there. Assyria was an ancient state, but I'm going to be focusing on what we call the late or Neo-Assyrian period, from the 9th through the 7th century BC, when Assyria was the major imperial power in much of the Middle East. During that time, kings in the cities of Kalhu, that is modern Nimrud, Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, and Ninua, that is Nineveh, today in the middle of the modern city of Mosul, administered and fought military campaigns across an area stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, or as they would say, from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea. This map shows us how the empire expanded through the 9th, and then 8th, and then 7th centuries BC. Here's another map of the region, and this time we're going to zoom in on that area in northern Iraq that formed the core of the empire. The names in bold were each at some time the Assyrian capital. First Ashur, then Nimrud, then Khorsabad, and finally Nineveh. Now, those palaces were largely destroyed at the end of the 7th century BC as the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and their ruins lay buried for 2,500 years, until in the 19th century, European antiquarians began tunneling into the mounds, looking for the sculptures of biblical Nineveh. Those early excavations in the 1840s and 50s were destructive. The British and French excavators received permissions from the Ottoman government to remove and export sculptures they found, which they did on a massive scale. More recently, the sites have been subject to another kind of damage, that is large-scale deliberate destruction during the occupation of northern Iraq by the so-called Islamic State, also known as ISIS or Daesh, when the destruction of ancient monuments and religious sites took place alongside awful human suffering in places like Mosul. So that gives us something of the ancient and modern situation, but there's also another way I'd like us to get situated. My own interests are in the history of the field and the modern reception of the ancient past. And in relation to that, there are two main points I want to make tonight. First, that the preconceptions and models we bring to ancient art profoundly shape how we interpret it. When things seem intuitive and obvious, it often just means they're intuitive and obvious in the interpreter's particular cultural setting. And the kind of evidence we're working with is often very malleable and can be made to fit our expectations, even when that's not our intention. Second, and closely related, that implies a dose of humility. Just like everyone else, I'm an interpreter stuck in my own time and place, my own epistemological frog pond, and that shapes what I think. I'm going to try and debunk or challenge some of what I think are historical misconceptions as I talk this evening, but as I do, please remember that I'm wrong too. Time will tell exactly how. So let's start with the Assyrian relief held by the Art Institute of Chicago. It's the head of what we know to be a standing winged figure. Here's a comparable complete figure at the Met. The relief came to the Art Institute from the collection of the early 20th century collector George F. Harding. And like many sculptures from Nimrud that came to Western collections in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was cut down in modern times, making a more portable object that almost resembles a Western portrait bust. Even apparently complete sculptures like the Met example I just showed, in fact had their backs cut down to make them light enough to transport on rafts down the river Tigris to meet ships at Basra, while others were cut into multiple parts to allow them to be transported overland across Syria. One of the jobs of modern students of this material has been to study the archival sources to try and work out exactly where the fragments now in collections around the world originally fitted in the palaces. The Art Institute relief was part of a program in what we now call the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, built in the 9th century BC by a king named Ashurnasirpal, and specifically from a reception room on the southern side of that palace's main inner courtyard. Several reliefs in the Met today actually come from the same room in that palace. What's reconstructed in the Assyrian sculpture court at the Met is a composite. The reliefs come from multiple rooms and evoke multiple spaces and even buildings, but they do roughly represent the layout and content of several of the reception rooms in the Northwest Palace. In this particular view, the layout is also intended to evoke what the king would have seen looking down the length of the throne room. The reliefs are filled with supernatural winged figures, some with human heads, some with the heads of eagles, alongside figures of the king and his human courtiers. Ashurnasirpal himself was one of the builders of the empire. The inscriptions running across the middle of the reliefs describe his military achievements, campaigns at a time when the Assyrian state was still relatively small, but reaching as far west as the Mediterranean on these military expeditions. But also the construction of the palace, including all the materials that were used in that construction. The stone of the reliefs was local, although extracting, positioning, and carving it represented a monumental amount of labor and expense. Other materials, like the cedar beams of the ceilings, had to be imported from distant lands, which I'm sure is partly why they're mentioned explicitly in the inscriptions. Now, one way in which a picture like this is inaccurate is the lack of color. The subtle appearance of the reliefs today might appeal to our contemporary sensibilities. I think it's quite a beautiful space, but it's not how the palace originally appeared. We know that the reliefs were brightly painted and fragments of pigment do survive. We don't know enough to reconstruct the original appearance accurately and in detail, but we can say, for example, that the beards and hair were rendered in black, that the pupils and whites of the eyes were picked out, that red, yellow, black, and white appear on the patterns of clothing, that blue was sometimes used to render the grey of horses and perhaps even the characters in the inscriptions. The plaster walls above the reliefs were also painted, and that's before we even get to textiles and furniture. You really have to refill and repopulate a room like this in your mind's eye. And I'll also admit that we in museums have to develop new ways to help do that. The images I've shown so far are only one part of the story, however. There are also other kinds of scenes in the palaces, especially in the throne room of this palace, of hunting and warfare. So here we see Ashurnasirpal in a chariot hunting lions. And here his army besieging an unnamed city. I'll pause just a moment to note that the reliefs take a very practical, non-heroic view of the thing. Assyrian campaign reliefs are not about individual Assyrian heroes being incredibly strong or brave. They're usually showing organized collective action, and in this case, siege engineering, including undermining the city walls. The hero of this story, I would suggest, is the logistics. Soon after this palace was discovered, others were found where military scenes formed the majority of the reliefs, as well as one in which those hunting scenes had been developed into something far grander and more extensive. So these things were important. Now, I've already started throwing interpretations around a little, but what did that mid-19th century European audience make of these images when they first were excavated? Well, the first thing to say is that they found them oddly straightforward. The biblical and classical sources, as well as 19th century European racialized views of historical and artistic progress, had primed them to find a cruel and militaristic empire whose kings were despots, and so that's what they found. Sadly, we don't have as much in the way of direct sources on the local reaction to the discoveries, though that may be starting to change now we're seeing more historians working with the Ottoman archival sources in this period. And there's good reason to think that the European sources overplay the superstitions expressed by local workmen, both to give added color to their accounts and to emphasize a gap and cultural discontinuity between past and present, the political ramifications of which are actually still playing out today in some ways. I will say that the fact that the excavations were European isn't for want of strong academic, historical and historiographic traditions in the Ottoman Empire, even in Baghdad and Mosul. But the particular intellectual history of Europe from the Renaissance on, including a very particular kind of antiquarianism, a fascination with the physical remains of the past in a world where previously only received texts had been seen as viable authorities. That fascination gradually did grow into something more scholarly in its ambitions. And so the logic of digging into the mounds was one that made perhaps more sense in terms of European intellectual aims. It also had to do with the aims of acquisition. You know, they didn't know initially what was lying in those mounds, but it certainly became the case that exporting sculptures to European museums became a major, even a defining aim at some points. At first, the main way that people saw the reliefs in Europe was as drawings transferred to woodcuts, engravings, and lithographs in the Illustrated London News, and then in Nineveh and its Remains, a book by one of the excavators, Austin Henry Layard, that became a bestseller. Perhaps that added to the sense of them as simple and narrative, something almost like a cartoon strip in their format. Even the winged human-headed lions and bulls that became the iconic images of the discovery and something truly unfamiliar were processed and seemed amazingly straightforward and apparent to some people. Layard himself wrote that, quote, "They could find no better type of intellect and knowledge than the head of the man, of strength than the body of the lion, of rapidity and motion than the wings of the bird. These winged human-headed lions were not idle creations, the offspring of mere fancy. Their meaning was written upon them," unquote. Or at least for a Victorian audience, it seemed to be. The military reliefs can be quite grisly, showing soldiers piling up the heads of defeated enemies to be counted. And that too fed into a prior expectation. Assyria's reputation in Western tradition had been shaped by largely hostile biblical and classical sources. In the former especially, Assyria generally appeared as an aggressive military power, as for example in Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. The dominant interpretation quickly became that the relief program was about intimidation, that the image's purpose was ultimately to unnerve visiting foreign dignitaries. And it's interesting to think about how easily that line of thinking worked in that context. So our Victorian audience saw, I think, colossal statues for intimidation of those entering the palace, a pagan gods of war. In this case, they initially thought one named in the Bible as Nisroch. The king himself presiding over everything, and every relief carrying bombastic inscriptions trumpeting his achievements. Scenes presenting the king at leisure, hunting wild animals. And most of all, scenes celebrating war and destruction, designed to chill the blood of foreign visitors and perhaps even indulge the whims of a cruel tyrant. Case closed. Except, of course, that it's not. And in fact, a scholar of Assyrian art today would disagree with just about all of what I've just said. As we've learned more about the way ancient Mesopotamian art works, and as we've moved through different intellectual paradigms for studying this material, a different kind of picture has emerged. There are several pieces to that change, much more than we can discuss tonight, but one of the most significant is an appreciation of ancient images as being made not only as representations, but in some ways as manifestations and embodiments. That once created, they had agency, and through the simple fact of their existence, might in some way reinforce what they depicted. So now I'm going to run through that same set of images again, this time with what I think is more representative of a contemporary reading of the material. Sometimes facts have changed the interpretation. Sometimes it's more a matter of new layers being added or different emphases seeming more important over time. Sorry. So to start here, paired supernatural gateway figures have a very long history in the ancient Near East. They're guardians, they are protective, but mostly what they're protecting against are supernatural forces. This is a world in which demons and malign spirits were a very real and serious concern of state. These are people who consult omens and oracles in a scholarly way before making big political and military decisions. The palace in which the king operated needed to be protected as much as possible. And that's what these figures are also doing. I hesitate to ascribe a single identity to them, as I suspect they had multiple priestly layers that we don't fully understand. But we do know that they look just like depictions of the Apkallu, wise sages from before the Great Flood, from groups of what we can identify more definitely as Apkallu figures that were ritually buried below doorways. Again, they're about supernatural protection. They are divine, but they're not the great gods. The reason, incidentally, people initially thought Nisroch, the god who is mentioned in the Bible as the god of the temple where Sennacherib was supposed to be visiting when he was murdered, is it's to do with the words. There's in Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew that N-S-R is associated with eagles. The modern Arabic is for eagle is Nisr, the modern Hebrew is Nesher, and the Akkadian was Nashru, but it's a bit of a red herring. It's actually still not clear which god the Nisroch of the Bible refers to. The royal image is very important, and it's certainly not just a matter of vanity. The king was the bridge between the human and the divine realms, and the latter, of course, ultimately determined everything from military security to rainfall and disease. The king's perfect appearance in these reliefs was, again, a matter of state. The inscriptions certainly are boastful, but they're also projecting and manifesting royal success and perhaps reinforcing the protective function of that imagery. The inscription on these reliefs is actually not very long, but it repeats and repeats around the walls of the palace, just like the reliefs of supernatural figures. And perhaps in their repetition, the king's glory and achievements act not just as propaganda, but as some kind of encircling protection. Hunting scenes. Now, these are about royal prowess, but they're much more than that. And they're not really leisure. They're an important part of the king's ritual function, and they had symbolic and spiritual significance. There's a great thread in Mesopotamian texts of the king's role with the sanction of the gods in bringing order to a chaotic world. And we now tend to interpret the hunting scenes, and especially lion hunts, primarily in that light. They're not simple pleasure expeditions. They're followed by scenes of the king in a ritual setting, pouring libations over the slain animals. And I'll just show you a relief from a later palace where that ritual setting is a little more clearly expressed. But here for me is where it gets really interesting. The campaign reliefs seem so secular, so documentary. It's a good trick. We're looking for someone to show us ancient events happening, and here they are. Their coherence as scenes is so seductive, but they're not straightforward, not at all. Of course not. They're highly compressed, highly selective. They are propagandistic, but again, they're not just representing the world in a way the king liked or that flattered him. They're manifesting it in a way that Assyria needed it to be. They never show any harm coming to an Assyrian soldier, because to do so would be to create a risk, a danger in the physical world. The way they think about images precludes ever representing a heroic death of the kind you might see in Greek vase painting, for example. There are hundreds of campaign reliefs, and in later palaces, they're not just in more public staterooms like the throne room, but run all the way through into what seem like more administrative suites and private apartment suites of members of the royal family. So again, that idea of this intimidated foreign dignitary starts to break down. The campaign reliefs are especially interesting to me because they are so strange in terms of ancient Near Eastern art more broadly. For all its complexity, most Assyrian palace art fits into traditions that had existed for thousands of years. Now, that's true of scenes of royal conquest and triumph as well, but the campaign reliefs are doing something a little bit different to that. The simple traditional way to represent military success would be the image of the king triumphing over an enemy. What we get instead is a cast of thousands, all the ordinary soldiers, all the details of siege warfare, all the long lines of prisoners and the administration of prisoners, and you see at the bottom there, booty. Most striking of all to me, there's this insistent growing presence of extended, detailed landscapes. Now, I know it's hard to read the surface of this big relief in a photograph, so I'll just briefly show the 19th century drawing where you can actually see it continue on. This program extended around an entire room. Now, most ancient Near Eastern art employs landscapes in a very economical way. There's a repertoire of symbols to represent topographic features like mountains and rivers, and the presence of those symbols is enough to know that a particular setting is intended. That's still largely true in Ashurnasirpal's reliefs in the 9th century. We see a little bit of hilly topography indicated sometimes, or a river when the army needs to cross it, but really no more than is needed to tell the story. But something more complicated was already developing. These are fragments of bronze gate bands from another Assyrian city, Balawat, ancient Imgur-Enlil, and from the time of Ashurnasirpal, and in this case, this particular band, his son and successor, Shalmaneser III. And they show similar scenes, sometimes with more detail, despite being much smaller. These gate bands are kind of inches high, where the reliefs are often meters high. In the Balawat gate bands, it's common to find place names. And here I'm showing one striking geographical episode, an expedition of Shalmaneser to find the source of the river Tigris, whose explicit focus on geography and topography required representing that landscape in a sort of different and innovative way, which I think you can see with these extended scale patterns and the rituals around that moment. Now, by the late 8th century BC, and here we're looking at something from around 700 BC, the campaign images in the palaces look quite different. This scene comes from what we now call the Southwest Palace at Nineveh, built by Sennacherib and called by him the Palace Without Rival. That palace was filled with campaign scenes and filled with landscapes, to which Sennacherib's successors added in very similar styles. Here, we see hilly terrain on a campaign to the west. In fact, we know exactly where because it's identified in inscriptions on the reliefs themselves as part of Sennacherib's siege of Lachish in Judah, an event that's also described in the Bible. Other scenes take place in the watery landscape of the marshes, in the far south of Iraq, or as in this case, probably southeastern Iran. The dress of some of the figures here connects them with a state called Elam in that area, with which Assyria fought multiple wars. And despite the military character of the scenes, sometimes the reliefs are filled with plant and animal detail, suggesting the natural abundance of these landscapes. Some places, like the marshes, we know were charged with mythological connections, and it's hard not to see a certain wonder and fascination with these landscapes in depictions like this. Here, we're looking at a line of prisoners in Babylonia, that is southern Iraq. That landscape, all alluvial plain, is very flat, but it was also extremely rich agriculturally. The Assyrian sculptures represent that with date palms, a particularly valuable crop and one that stood tall in the landscape. So all through these Babylonian scenes, the date palms repeat and repeat to form a background. And they're all and always shown fruiting. They're another pointer to a sort of image of natural abundance. Now, my argument is that a big part of what's going on with these extensive landscape backgrounds is an attempt to manifest the empire at its imperial center. The royal family and administrative elite of the palace at Nineveh did not necessarily travel all over the empire, and for them, many of the lands represented would have seemed very distant. Yet, through the campaign reliefs, they were brought back to the administrative center and shown under tight control. I think that's what a lot of the emphasis on lines of prisoners and counting the booty of campaigns is about. It's a triumph of the king, but the king also represents the state. And the world shown in the reliefs is a triumphant, successful imperial state. The sculptors of the palace reliefs developed new ways to show the larger world Assyria now controlled. And one of these was to develop more expansive ways of representing foreign landscapes. Now, again, I don't think that any of these reliefs work purely and only at the level of a human audience. It was important that they show everything running smoothly. Ironically, the passage of time in the use of this palace undermines that, at least in our eyes today. We see Sennacherib suppressing rebellions in the south and achieving complete control, and then Ashurbanipal doing the same thing a couple of generations later, and then Sin-Shar-Ishkun doing the same thing again a generation after that. There's a clear and vitally important counter-reading of all of these reliefs. Those rebellions kept happening, and they were a big problem. And eventually, they started succeeding. Now, that's actually one way that we can see that the palace reliefs weren't just representations in a sense we're most familiar with today. The damage that was done to the reliefs when the Assyrian cities finally fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in the late 7th century BC was not random at all. It's very directed. People went in an organized way to remove or deface the faces of Assyrian royalty, particularly, I think, Sennacherib and his grandson Ashurbanipal, both of whom had sacked the city of Babylon in southern Iraq, a place that was sacred to them as well as to the Babylonians. Here you can see very clearly the face of Sennacherib again as part of the siege of Lachish has been removed. There are many other examples of this phenomenon. Here, Ashurbanipal celebrates a triumph over his Elamite enemy, a king named Teoman, whose head hangs in a tree at the left. If we zoom in, Ashurbanipal and the female figure in the relief, who I think is would say is a queen named Libali Sharat, have both had their faces damaged, and Ashurbanipal's drinking hand and cup have been damaged too. His ability to drink has been removed in some sense. One of the most striking examples of all is this relief. Again, it's a lion hunt, and in part of it, Ashurbanipal originally held a lion by the tail. Quite a lot of care has been taken to remove part of the tail so that the lion and all the dangerous forces it represents is no longer under the king's control. In a reading like this, the palace wasn't simply or even primarily a surface for propaganda. It was a way of conceiving the center of empire that aimed to protect its core and to reinforce and manifest its imperial vision. The campaign reliefs offer a unique model of the Assyrians' terrestrial universe, while the royal hunts and supernatural protective imagery manifest the king's connection to another, we would say, supernatural realm. We also see that kind of thinking extending outside the palace, where artificial landscapes and gardens were created, containing exotic plants and animals from distant parts of the empire. As the empire developed, I think that Assyrian kings increasingly aimed to create microcosms at its center, not just to represent it, but almost to create it. They populated the walls with people, animals, and plants, with whole landscapes, creating a manifestation of the empire inside the palace and constructing an idealized relationship between a vast, difficult to control, frequently rebellious empire and its grand but ultimately vulnerable rulers. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that fascinating presentation. And so I think we do still have a few minutes now to turn to some questions from the audience. So just looking here, I can see that we have a couple of related questions about the carving of the reliefs. So there's a multi-part question here. What do we know about carving in relief versus carving in the round of this period? And further to that, is there significance in how either of these were used? And also a question about how we can see this at the Art Institute, which happy to handle that. But if you would be able to speak to the questions about the relief carving and carving in the round of this period.
Yes, that's a great question. Before I answer, can you hear me okay? My screen has frozen.
Yes.
Great, I'll talk and hopefully I will reappear. So we know a little, but it's tentative, and in some ways the distinction might not be so much between carving in the round and relief as between frontal and profile perspectives. So the reason I say that is that in particularly the palace of Ashurnasirpal that we've mostly been talking about this evening, those winged bulls and lions, people often point out that they have 5 legs. When you see them from the front, you see the 2 legs sort of standing firm. But when you come alongside them, you see the legs striding, you see 4 legs. So what's going on is that although it's in part acting as a sculpture in the round, it's also acting as two separate reliefs, one frontal and one profile, if that makes sense. There are also images of, there's a statue of Ashurnasirpal himself. Thank you. I'm so sorry. My presentation froze. I hope you could hear me when I was speaking.
Yes.
Great. And then the whole thing shut down. I'm so sorry.
No. Totally understand. In this world we live in, this still technical difficulties happen all the time. So thank you for returning. And then we have a few more questions. I think we might have time for just maybe another one or two. Let's see, another question that has come through is there a contemporary analog for the stories depicted, or are these specific to their time?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It comes back to that sort of, as I'm contrasting the sort of 19th and 21st century takes on some of this material. I think what analogies one feels are appropriate is a big part of what dictates that. And I think you could go down an interesting path thinking about modern imperial imagery, modern, say, military scenes, and the kinds of things that are emphasized when a modern imperial power wants to represent itself. And that can shed light on the choices that are being made. So, for example, I mentioned that you don't see sort of heroic figures dying. You know, that's something that, you know, I gave the example of Greek vase painting, but perhaps a better example would actually be the sort of the canonization of someone like Nelson in a certain part of British imperial tradition. Or you could think of the ways that some modern empires try very hard to represent themselves as consensual, as sort of happy comings together of all the people who make up the empire, you know, as opposed to this sort of being explicit about it being coercive, you know. So I think that what, in some ways, when our modern analogies, they do shape our thinking, but in some ways it's the points where there are disjunctions, where they don't quite work, that can be the most telling.
Wonderful. And we still have actually questions keep pouring in. So we have another question here about in interpreting the military expeditions and lion hunts, did the king need to put himself at risk and survive to prove that he was protected by the divine, and that therefore he could protect the people of his kingdom?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think he sometimes did, and that was sometimes a mistake. So the specific event I'm thinking of is that I talked a lot about Sennacherib and the palace at Nineveh. Now that comes about because Sennacherib's father, a king named Sargon, had built a whole new capital at Khorsabad, and that palace is sort of another whole phenomenon. Built this really extensive complex, but he died on a military campaign. His body wasn't recovered, and the omens that how inauspicious something like that seems to have been enough to prompt Sennacherib to abandon Khorsabad and build a new palace at an already ancient city, Nineveh, and sort of start again in some ways. Now, the kings in the lion hunts are shown doing extremely ill-advised things like grabbing lions by the tail and even sometimes reaching out and holding them by the mane, which risky. I very much doubt that was that it couldn't be safely managed. And later in the reliefs, it's really explicit and really clear that this is a managed process. There's something oddly frank about Assyrian reliefs in some ways. So they show the lions being released from cages, from crates. You know, these are, and they show the audience kind of trying to get a look from a nearby vantage point. They show the enclosure with soldiers with spears. It's certainly a very managed process, and I don't think there was any problem with kings sort of avoiding risk. There's a thing called the substitute king ritual, where if the omens suggested a time of particular danger to the king, it was possible to put someone else sort of momentarily on the throne while that danger passed, and then that unfortunate person would have to be executed. And so I do think that underneath it all, I think we're seeing a lot of protection of the king, is my instinct.
Wonderful. And I think, excuse me, so sorry all, I'm just getting over being sick, so I'm still a bit froggy. I think we have just a tiny bit more time. Let's see, I think, one question I actually think would be really helpful to hear about, Michael, is you had mentioned earlier in your talk about the fact that these reliefs were largely painted, were largely in color, that I think, again, the idea that we really do need to repopulate in our mind's eye these images with color, which is something, as many of our audience members, as you may be well aware, that much of the ancient world, as we now know, was very often brightly colored in a way that sort of, we don't see these works the way they appear today. And so with that in mind, with the works in the Metz collection specifically, to what extent has the museum been able to do technical analyses, or have located specific pigments, or is this sort of a situation where they've been sort of long gone by the time they came to the museum's collection, if there's any sort of
right. Oh no, that's a wonderful question. So I'll start by saying there's a little bit of surviving visible pigment on quite a few Assyrian reliefs, and it appears in different places depending on where you go. At the Met, there are a couple of examples where you can quite clearly see surviving pigment on the sandals of figures, for example. In other cases, the rosettes of a diadem might preserve some red, and then there are a couple of pieces to it. There's certainly a lot of pigment that even survived momentarily once these reliefs were excavated is probably lost. And when people are looking now for trace pigments in ways that of course weren't possible in the 19th century, I'm sure they bemoan that the casts were made of a lot of the reliefs in the early days, which I'm sure had an impact, for example. But they do find traces of pigment. The problem is that I don't think you get instances where you find enough on a single relief. So it's really a bit of a collective operation. In an exhibition a few years ago, we included an image that showed a sort of speculative reconstruction of pigments on a single figure, but the evidence for that reconstruction really came from multiple figures, if that makes sense. So it's definitely not all doom and gloom, but yes, fragmentary evidence.
Excellent. And that's, again, I think something so important that I think as the scholarship in the field continues to progress, that incorporating this kind of technical information really helps, across all of the fields of the ancient Mediterranean world, really sheds new light on the way in which these objects were viewed and experienced in their original context.
Yeah, and there's a side to it that is also much more cultural and about language. And there's a wonderful scholar called Chianti Tavapalam, whose work kind of brings together this sort of what we know about color with the language that was being used around color and the sort of qualities of particularly shine and dullness as a big vector of meaning. So those cultural settings are just as important as the scientific analysis, I think.
Exactly. Excellent. That is, I think, a perfect point to sort of conclude on for this evening. And I'd just like to say thank you again, Michael, for your very engaging and really informative presentation this evening. And thank you all for joining us for this program, which was generously supported by the Mary Soleiman Lecture Fund. And we hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and we encourage you to come visit our collection of artworks from the broader ancient Mediterranean world in the Jaharis Galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art on your next visit to the museum. And for more information on upcoming virtual events, please see us online at artic.edu, that's artic.edu, and also look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.